Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much. This is the first time I share this material to an audience, and for me, it's very important. So thank you so much for being here. I will start from a quote taken from Zizek, from Myth to Agape, one of his essay from the 70s. The quote starts like this: the philosophical overcoming of the myth is not simply a letting behind of the mythical, but a constant struggle with it. Philosophy needs the recourse to myth, not only for external reasons, in order to explain its conceptual teaching to the uneducated crowds, but inherently to suture its own conceptual edifice where it fails to reach its innermost core. From Plato's myth of the cave to Freud's myth of the primordial father and Lacan's myth of Lamella. Myth is thus the real of logos, the foreign intruder, impossible to get rid of, impossible to remain fully within. End of quote. This quote was very important to me. The more I studied philosophy and psychoanalysis, and more the myth in the form of magical practices became present in my life as a symptom, as an intruder. This condition made me suffer because I was living this contradiction between materialistic and atheistic knowledge and practices instead that involved dealing with the angels, demons, rituals, etc. I suffered this split. This presentation is an introduction on how I try to solve this contradiction by secularizing magic practices through Lacanian thinking, and more in general through contemporary philosophy and psychoanalysis. It is how I created a suture between these two traditions, opening up a surprising new horizon for both Gnosticism and philosophy. In this presentation, I will focus on the most important concept of Thelema, true will, and how philosophy and psychoanalysis allowed me to reach a universal definition of it by demystifying this concept and make it more accessible to wider non-initiated audiences. Thelema is the magical tradition I embraced. Let me spend a few words about what Thelema is. Thelema is a religious and philosophical system developed in the early 20th century by the English occultist Aleister Crowley. It is based on the principle, do what you will shall be the whole of the law. So do what you want, that's the only law, which emphasize individual freedom, self-discovery, and pursuing one's true purpose or true will. Thelema draws inspiration from various mystical and occult traditions, including elements of Western esotericism, Gnosticism, and ceremonial magic. It incorporates rituals, symbolism, and meditation practices as a means to explore spiritual growth and self-realization. Thelema is often associated with the concept of true will, which refers to an individual's unique and authentic path in life, aligned with their innermost desires and purpose. Its complex and multifaceted system has inspired a diverse community of practitioners and continues to influence esoteric and occult circles. The word Thelema itself means will. However, in the standard practice of Thelema, the true will is often associated with the conflicting partial definitions, leading to confusion and ambiguity about where exactly we should find clarity. This represents a significant problem. How can we authentically follow the path of Thelema if its most fundamental concept lacks coherence? What does it mean to follow one's true will? In short, there are three definitions in current Thelemic practices with which this concept is associated. True will as freedom of choice, true will as a divine plan to which one must adapt, true will as the actualization of one's authentic nature, often conflicting with one's reason or critical thinking. It is not difficult to notice how these definitions of true will contradict with each other. If true will as freedom of choice is the ultimate realization of critical thinking, how can it be at the same time a divine plan imposed on the subject by a higher intelligence to which one must adapt? And if true will means actualizing one's authentic nature by passing the filter of critical thinking, how can it simultaneously be freedom of choice and thus the ultimate realization of critical thinking? It is necessary to find a universal definition of true will that resolves these contradictions. Particularly relevant to my research for a universal concept of what true will truly means is one of Giorgio Agamben's seminars, An Archaeology of the Concept of Will, that traces its history from ancient Greece, where it first appeared, to the Christian context, where it is elaborated in its current form. Agamben begins his exploration starting from Aristotle. It is in this context that the concept of will, as we know it today, makes its first appearances. The context in which Aristotle uses the concept of will is the transition from potentiality to actuality. Aristotle developed this concept of will based on a purely philosophical problem. According to Aristotle, potentiality is an ambiguous concept. Being able to do something also means being able not to do that same thing. Aristotle seeks to define potentiality not based on actuality, but in itself. What does it truly mean to have the power to do something? An architect remains an architect even if they don't build a house. Possessing a faculty allows a person to actualize that faculty. The architect builds a house, but it also allows them not to actualize it without ceasing to possess that power. Potentiality in this sense is the conjunction of two opposite powers. The power to be, the architect actualizes power to build a house, and also the power not to be. The architect decides not to build a house without ceasing to be an architect. At this point in his analysis, Aristotle faced the problem of explaining how one can move from potentiality to actuality. Why does the architect decide to build a house at a certain point? What determines the actualization of potentiality if it is simultaneously the ability to act and the ability not to act? At this point, Aristotle turns to a sovereign principle superior to potentiality, which he calls orexis, which can be translated as appetite or more accurately, desire. The architect moves into action because they desire to build a house. Thus, we encounter the first definition of will in the form of desire here. Following Agamben's analysis, this dynamic encounters a substantial change with the advent of Christianity. While in Aristotle, the transition to action was guaranteed by the subject's desire and therefore their nature, in Christianity, human nature is defined as guilty and in need of redemption. In other words, Christianity blocks the subject's capacity to move into action because what guarantees this transition is now put to question. The new Christian law deactivates the mechanism that allowed actualization in ancient times. In St. Paul, we witness these ruptures as something that painfully creates a rift within the subject, between what they can do and what they actually do. This is in the letters of the Romans, where he describes this painful situation where he feels split between what he should do, the new Christian law, and what he's actually doing. That is like following his nature and desire, carnal flesh desire. And
like I do that which I don't want to do, and I don't do that which I should do.
Exactly.
Something like this.
Yeah, exactly. St. Augustine will be the one to restore the connection between potentiality and actuality that was destroyed by the advent of the Christian law, resorting once again to the concept of will, but no longer associated with desire and nature, which are now considered sinful. Instead, it is related solely to the will placed absolutely at the origin. Will in St. Augustine is not presupposed to anything, neither to nature nor to a mythical destiny, as it was in Aristotle. Nothing better than the issue of the creation of the world by the Christian God allows us to understand the profound difference between the Aristotelian model and the Christian one. In this context, God becomes the model of the new Christian subject, characterized by an absolute freedom and contingency, in contrast to the ancient subjectivity based on nature and necessity. This shift marks the transition from ancient wisdom to modernity. As the paradigm of the new Christian subject, the Christian God, while creating the world, experiences the same division we observe in St. Paul. God is portrayed as split into two distinct powers, potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata. This separation mirrors the divide between potentiality and actuality in St. Paul. Potentia absoluta represents God's boundless creative power before the act of creation and signifies his omnipotence. Potentia ordinata, on the other hand, refers to God's choice to actualize only a few of the infinite possibilities within his potentia absoluta. The Christian God is fundamentally divided between what he can do and what he's doing, between his unlimited creative power, potentia absoluta, and the specific creation he decided to actualize, potentia ordinata. Like St. Paul's experience of the rift between what he can and what he does, between God's law and the law of the corrupted nature, the Christian God is divided between his omnipotence, potentia absoluta, and his actions, potentia ordinata. This raises questions such as why God, who is capable of anything, created this world instead of another, or why he chose to incarnate in Christ rather than a woman or a dog, for example. Within the context of the world's creation by the Christian God, the notion of free will enables the connection between potentiality and actualization to be reestablished. Unlike Aristotle's perspective, where the transition to action occurs through desires as a necessary consequence of God's nature, in the Christian understanding, it takes place as an act of absolute freedom, unconstrained by any presuppositions. This implies that God confronts the void of nothingness before creation, or the tangible exercise of his will. God's will exists at the very beginning, even preceding the Logos, and in a sense, before God himself. Hence, the word's creation is ex nihilo, forged from nothingness, accentuating the absolute autonomy and freedom of divine action. God did not create the world out of necessity, but because just simply he desired to do so. In response to the question of why did God create heaven and earth, Augustine answers is simply because he wished to do so. The historical process outlined above, suppressing desire with will as an act of absolute freedom, has significant implications for subjectivity. While the ancient Greek subject recognized their deeper identity in the nature or destiny that determined their action, the Christian subject now encounters an absolute impossibility of identification with their innermost core. Where the ancient Greek subject discovered their destiny, nature, and identity, the Christian subject now faces the abyss and an inability to recognize themselves as a unique entity. The link observed in Aristotle between potentiality and actualization, facilitated by desire, ensured the ancient subject had natural limitations to their possibilities. What the ancient Greek subject could or could not do was inherently determined by the confines set by their presupposed nature or destiny. However, as we have seen in the Christian context, while all presuppositions fall away, there is no longer a limit to what the subject can be, leading to an infinite expansion of potential selves. Potentia absoluta, before illustrating God's omnipotence about creation, signifies God's inability to declare, I am this, definitively. If this act is unconscious, it is because it coincides with the emergence of consciousness as such. There is no subject present who can recall its performance. The operation itself forms the subject, marking its first emergence, and for this reason, it is necessarily unconscious. It's like one of those special painting, where there is the hand that draw the hand, and then they draw the hand, and it's this loop that it has to be unconscious because it's the emergence of the consciousness. Thanks to this archaeological and historical research into the true meaning of will, I can finally develop a universal concept of true will that resolves the contradiction we previously identified in Thelema's practices. Following one's true will means attaining the primordial dimension of subjectivity, as we have observed in the context of the Christian God's creation of the world. As we discussed in the earlier analysis, the act of will through which the Christian God creates the world is fundamentally an act of subjectification, wherein God determines its original and primordial identity. Lacan described the emergence of the subject and how it constructs its original identity in what he calls the mirror stage. This concept is based on the empirical observation that infants start recognizing their image reflected in the mirror in the 6th month of their life. However, starting from the 1950s, this concept in Lacan begins to acquire a paradigmatic value as a permanent structure of subjectivity rather than a chronological phase of the infant's life. Lacan describes this process through which consciousness emerges from the jumble of instincts and drives as the progressive formation of an image, which is configured in its original form as an interface between an interior world and an exterior world, a filter between the internal processes of the organism and the inputs from the outside world. In other words, the image in which the child recognizes himself is the formation of the subject opposite to the world. This primary identification with this image in the mirror stage relieves the infant vulnerable condition with an illusion of control over the absolute fragmentation he or she experiences when he or she is still one with the real. The image marks a distance, a gap, the sides of which become the conditions of possibility for forming an internal self and a corresponding reality. The immediate consequence of this event is that the infant gains coordination in his body, becoming able to move more effectively in the space surrounding him. In this sense, the primordial image is configured as an interface that provides the infant with a sense of union with his or her body, relieving the anguish of a condition otherwise dominated by lack and dependence. Without this interface, the infant has no sense of self and cannot act in the world. We therefore begin to perceive a profound correspondence between the mirror stage described by Lacan and the creation of the world by the Christian God. When God is not yet God, faced with the abyss of his absolute power, he is in a position similar to the infant before the mirror stage, a condition of absolute helplessness, unable to organize any effective act or action due to his lack of subjectivity. The act of absolute will, through which God unconsciously finally decides, I am this, is the theological correspondent of the mirror stage in which the infant recognizes himself in his own reflected image, transforming him into a capable subject that can actualize his will.
Is this your thinking?
Yes.
Did you come up with this?
Yes. For both, this event coincides with the emergence of a world opposed to an interior world. This original image in which both God and the infant identify is first of all the creation of a border between an interior, the self, and an exterior, the not self. As we have seen, this process is structurally unconscious and configured as a constitutive limit of human experience, an asymptotic edge, so to speak, to which we contend towards infinity, but must necessarily remain excluded from our experience, if not at the cost of dissolving the subject. This means that we are always faced with this split between consciousness and unconscious, which has already and always been completed, given that the way this split emerges for the first time is itself unconscious. In other words, we are aware of our consciousness, but how we got there is inaccessible to us. In this sense, the repression of the emergence of our self, of subject, is primordial in the literal sense. However, this primordial repression is not given once and for all, but must be renewed constantly if our subjectivity must continue to operate. To be what I am, to preserve that subjectivity that I unconsciously choose in the mirror stage, I must necessarily repress the access to that auroral dimension. If repression should fail, in fact, it is the symbolic death of the subject. On the other hand, if the repression, on the contrary, remains effective, not only the subject's deepest identities is saved, but also the split between conscious and unconscious continues to be effective, thus creating the experiential universe of the subject in its entirety. Briefly said, the condition of possibility for the subject and the world is the primordial and constantly renewed repression of the mirror stage, through which this subjectivity emerged as such for the first time. This is why the fathers of the church are very careful to point out how God's potentia absoluta vanishes once his potentia ordinata is actualized. God could have incarnated himself in a woman and a dog, since he's omnipotent. Still, this decision is irreversible once he has decided to incarnate himself in Christ through a free act of will. According to what has been said, the reason for this irreversibility should be clear. If, as we have seen, the world's creation is above everything else an act of God's subjectification, then this subjectification needs to be protected from anything that could put it back into question. Potentia absoluta must be repressed, because it is that dimension which, if it were accessible again, could shatter everything down. God as a subject would dissolve, the interface between inside and outside guaranteed by the primordial image would fail, and the world as a result would virtualize. Therefore, the irreversibility of God's will is in solidarity with the repression of his potentia absoluta, so that God as a subject, and with him the world he created, can remain operational. On this level, it is perhaps possible to mark the first fundamental difference between Christianity and Thelema. If it becomes fundamental for Christianity to maintain the repression of God's potentia absoluta for the reasons we have seen, for Thelema instead seems crucial to keep alive the connection between potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata in what Crowley calls the apprehension of unity between the self and the not self. Aleister Crowley believed in the self and the not self as fundamental components of human consciousness and spiritual development. This is a quote from Duty, one of his scripts, Aleister Crowley script. The quote: "The ill springs from the belief in two things, the self and the not self, and the conflict between the two. Ultimately, the problem is how to destroy this perception of duality, to attain the apprehension of unity between the self and the not self. In Crowley's view, the self refers to an individual's true nature or essence, often hidden or obscured by social conditioning and other external factors. Crowley believed in the importance of self-exploration and introspection through meditation, ritual magic, and other spiritual disciplines to better understand the self. On the other hand, the not self refers to everything external to the self, including other people, material possessions, and the physical world around us. How do we attain the apprehension of unity between the self and the not self? Let's go back to Aristotle and the example of the architect to answer this question. Architecture creates a division between an interior and an exterior, using walls and a roof. If we think of the power to be as the self and the power not to be as the not self, the actualization of the power to be is the construction of the house, while the power not to be is the virgin space before any construction." So we can get back to the image, like,
Yeah. Okay, 1 second.
I'm sorry about this.
No, I had it up here, but now it's share the screen.
Here we have just a childish drawing of what I mean by this, like There is the space, the sun, the tree, and the landscape, and the house. And it's like so the duality between the self so let's architecture creates a division between an interior and an exterior using walls and a roof. If we think of the power to be as the self and the power not to be as the not self, the actualization of the power to be is the construction of the house, while the power not to be is the virgin space before any construction. This one. This is the power not to be. The one before it was the power to be with the house. In a traditional house, we can move to the next one. The next one, yeah. In a traditional house, the architect actualizes the power to be, but leaves behind the power not to be, which is repressed and kept out of sight within the house walls. This duality between the self and the not self is maintained through the walls, which act as repression. The space outside the house can only be experienced through windows. You can move on to the next. Which keep at a distance at some the not self, the outside is kept at a safe distance as something outside or remote. In contrast, in an experimental house, the tension between the outside and the inside is not repressed, but rather exposed and put into dialectic. You can move. This is an experimental house, and also the following one. Yes, here is better. You can see here that the tension between the outside and the inside is not repressed, but rather exposed and put into a dialectic. In this type of house, the virgin space is not repressed, and the walls are not traditional walls, but rather membranes that merge the self, the house, and the not self, the virgin space. You can move to the next one. Yeah. So the power not to be is actualized by including elements within the house that contradict its identity. The dividing structure in this type of house are syncretic dimensions where internal and external become undecidable. The traditional separation between the self and the not self is reversed by placing the inside outside and the outside inside. The windows here are not representation of the exteriors, as we saw in the traditional house, but holes where the self and the not self, the inside and the outside, the power to be and the power not to be, enter an in-between dimension where it is impossible to separate them. The space here is not repressed, but become part of the self and vice versa. We have arrived at a universal definition of what is true will. The actualization of the power not to be in a finite existence, the production of a form of life in which the self and the not self become indistinguishable, the subject's effort to free themselves from the yoke of identities and accept the not being in their being. Through analyzing the concept of will in the Christian context where it was born, particularly about the problem of the world's creation, we have highlighted the profound correspondence with the mirror stage in Lacan. Finally, we paid particular attention to the necessary function of primordial repression to keep the opposition between the subject and the world operative. Through the archaeology of the will, we have learned how its ontological position coincides with a dimension of absolute freedom, in the sense that will is not presupposed by anything, neither nature nor by a mythical destiny, as it happened for the Greek subject. The apprehension of unity between the self and the not self is structurally linked to the confrontation with the primordial repression from which the subject emerges and which finds identification with a primordial image. If I had more time, we could take a step further and explore what it means, this journey towards this paradoxical heart of the subject. What happens to human subjectivity when it approaches primordial repression at that first edge between an inner world and an outer world, between conscious and unconscious, between subject and world, between the imaginary and the real? But that's another presentation. Yeah, thanks.